Impalement, one of the most feared and gruesome methods of execution in history, stands as a stark reminder of how punishment was often designed not only to kill, but to terrify entire populations. Across medieval Eastern Europe and the Near East, chroniclers repeatedly describe impalement as a weapon of terror, a punishment so extreme that its memory alone could cow villages, armies, and nations into submission. At its most basic, impalement was exactly what the word suggests. A condemned person was pierced by a sharpened stake or pole, and their body was left elevated for all to see. But the details of how it was carried out varied across regions and centuries, and those details made the difference between an execution that killed quickly and one that inflicted agony for hours, or even days. The executioner's skill, the type of stake used, and the purpose of the punishment all shape what followed. In its cruelest form, the stake was not driven through the chest or abdomen in a single fatal thrust. Instead, it was inserted carefully through the rectum, vagina, or side of the body, angled upward in such a way that it avoided vital organs. The goal was not to cause instant death, but to prolong suffering. The condemned would be hoisted upright, the pole fixed firmly in the ground, and left to writhe as their own body weight pulled them slowly down the stake. In some accounts, this agony could last for hours. In others, it stretched into days, with victims surviving in torment as people passed by, witnessing the spectacle. This combination of slow suffering and public display made impalement a powerful instrument of psychological warfare. A hanged body might swing for a day, but an impaled body could remain on the roadside as a ghastly warning for weeks. Flies, carrion birds, and the stench of decay only amplified the message. This is what happens to those who defy authority. The origins of impalement are difficult to pin down with absolute certainty, but references to it appear in antiquity. The Assyrians are sometimes credited with early use, with reliefs depicting prisoners raised aloft on stakes as symbols of conquest. Biblical texts hint at related punishments, though translation issues blur whether hanging and impalement were the same practice in different eras. What is clearer is that by the medieval period, impalement had become an established form of punishment in parts of the Near East, spreading into Eastern Europe through the cultural and military exchanges of empires, wars, and invasions. By the time of the Byzantine Empire, diplomatic and travel accounts describe impalement as something that marked the borderlands between Christian and Muslim powers. Byzantine envoys, when encountering punishments in Ottoman or Balkan territories, often noted the practice with horror, framing it as a symbol of barbarity. Yet the same practice also appeared within Christian realms when rulers sought to send the harshest possible warning to rebels or enemies. One of the most infamous figures associated with impalement is Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered in legend as Vlad the Impaler. Ruling in the 15th century, Vlad faced the dual pressures of defending his small principality against Ottoman encroachment and consolidating power within his own turbulent realm. Chroniclers hostile to Vlad depict him as a ruler who leaned heavily on fear, lining roads with forests of impaled bodies to terrify foes. Some of these stories may have been exaggerated propaganda, crafted by his enemies in Saxon towns and by Ottoman chroniclers, but the core fact remains. Vlad used impalement systematically as a tool of intimidation. Accounts describe thousands of Ottoman prisoners impaled outside his capital, Targovic, after a campaign in the 1460s, according to one chilling tale. When Sultan Mehmed II advanced with his army and saw the impaled corpses stretching for miles, he recoiled in disgust and withdrew. Whether this story is embellished or not, it captures the essence of why rulers chose such a horrific method to project power in the most visceral way possible. The Ottomans themselves also employed impalement. Chroniclers detail its use as a punishment for rebels, deserters, or captured enemies. It was not reserved for the battlefield alone. Sometimes criminals within Ottoman cities faced the stake as a reminder of the state's reach and severity. European travelers who witnessed or heard of these executions often carried the tales home, where they circulated as proof of Ottoman cruelty. But we must remember that Europe, too, had its share of gruesome punishments. From drawing and quartering in England to burning at the stake for heresy, impalement stood out. However, because of its raw spectacle and its association with bodily violation that transgressed cultural taboos about dignity and death, descriptions from diplomats and envoys often emphasize the theatrical aspect of impalement. Bodies were raised in prominent places, along roads leading into cities, at the entrances of forts, on hills visible from afar. The condemned became unwilling actors in a political performance designed to terrify anyone considering treachery. In some cases, mass impalements created what looked like entire forests of human bodies, a grotesque landscape of punishment. Despite its brutality, impalement was not random. It was usually reserved for crimes considered especially threatening to authority, rebellion, treason, desertion, or attacks on rulers. The severity of the punishment matched the severity of the perceived crime. By choosing impalement, rulers declared that the offender had placed themselves beyond ordinary justice, deserving a fate that erased both life and dignity at the same time. The act of impalement was not always as uniform or meticulously carried out as chronicles suggest. Executioners varied in skill, and some condemned died quickly, pierced through the chest or abdomen in a way that killed them almost instantly. Others endured prolonged torment. Depending on how carefully the stake was positioned, the variability of death only added to the uncertainty and terror surrounding the punishment. What made impalement so effective was not only the suffering of the condemned, but also the psychological impact on communities forced to witness it. Imagine traveling along a road and seeing dozens of bodies raised on stakes, twisting in the wind, half-rotted, with birds feasting on their flesh. It was not just an execution. It was a message carved into the landscape, a reminder that authority was absolute and resistance would end in degradation. By the late medieval and early modern periods, impalement had become firmly associated with regions along the fault lines of empire, the Balkans, the Ottoman frontier, and parts of Eastern Europe. Western Europe, while fascinated and horrified by tales of the practice, increasingly used these accounts to cast their neighbors as barbaric or savage. Yet the universality of public execution across Europe reveals that all societies of the time relied on spectacle, pain, and fear to enforce order. Impalement simply pushed those principles to their most extreme form. As Europe entered the early modern age, the practice of impalement began to decline, but its reputation only grew. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Western travelers, diplomats, and missionaries in Ottoman lands brought home accounts of the punishment, spreading its notoriety far beyond the regions where it was still practiced. These reports often framed impalement as proof of the barbarity of the East, contrasting it with what they considered more civilized punishments in Western Europe, conveniently forgetting that their own lands were still home to burnings, wheelings, and hangings, all equally horrific in their own right. Part of what gave impalement its lasting cultural hold was how public it was. Unlike executions carried out behind closed doors or within prisons, impalement demanded to be seen. Even when the actual frequency of the punishment declined, its symbolic value remained. To accuse one's enemies of practicing impalement was to brand them as ruthless tyrants, and to threaten rebels or traitors with impalement was to summon the memory of all the horror it evoked, whether or not the stake was ever raised in practice. Diplomatic sources show that rulers understood this power well. Reports describe foreign ambassadors being deliberately shown rows of impaled bodies upon entering cities, a theatrical gesture meant to signal strength and discourage resistance. In some cases, the condemned were left to die along main roads specifically so armies, traders, and travelers could not ignore the warning. A man swinging from a gallows was an execution. A man writhing on a stake was a political statement. Figures like Vlad the Impaler cemented impalement's place in popular imagination. Even centuries later, he is remembered less for his strategies of statecraft than for his forest of stakes. Propaganda from his enemies exaggerated his cruelty, But the fact that these tales stuck demonstrates how uniquely terrifying impalement was. The punishment's physicality, its violation of the human body, and its lingering visibility all combined to burn it into memory in ways that other punishments rarely achieved. Ottoman chronicles also reveal that impalement was not confined to folklore. It remained a legal and military penalty for certain crimes, though often reserved for extreme cases. The method varied. Sometimes the condemned were laid flat and impaled horizontally, the stake fixed in the ground afterward. In other cases, they were lifted vertically from the start. In either version, the condemned screams, blood, and eventual silence became part of the ritualized performance of power. What makes impalement so fascinating from a historical perspective is not only the mechanics of the act, but the way it straddled law, spectacle, and propaganda. On one level, it was a punishment designed to eliminate someone considered an enemy of the state. On another, it was theater, staged for an audience who were meant to leave terrified and obedient. And on yet another, it was narrative, carried across borders in chronicles, travelers' tales, and propaganda designed to vilify enemies or glorify rulers. As Enlightenment ideas about law and punishment spread through Europe, executions became more regulated, and methods intended purely for prolonged torment began to disappear. Guillotines, firing squads, and hangings were defended as more humane, even though they still killed. In this new context, impalement began to look even more shocking and archaic, the very symbol of what reformers wanted to leave behind. By the 19th century, when reports still occasionally surfaced from frontier regions, Western audiences reacted with horror, using them as justification for labeling those societies as uncivilized. Yet impalement never fully vanished from cultural memory. Writers, historians, and later novelists returned to it as a symbol of cruelty. Vlad the Impaler, in particular, inspired both fear and fascination. His association with the stake feeding directly into the Dracula legend that captured Europe's imagination. Here, impalement transformed from a punishment into a symbol of monstrosity, reshaped by literature into something even more enduring than historical fact. Even in modern times, the word impale carries a visceral weight that few other punishments do. To speak of someone impaled summons not only the image of violent death but also the humiliation, the exposure, the utter helplessness of the condemned. It is a word that conjures fear instantly, which is exactly why rulers centuries ago chose it as their weapon of terror. Today, historians continue to debate the accuracy of some of the more sensational accounts. Were the numbers in the thousands, as some chronicles suggest, or were they inflated by propaganda? Did victims really survive for days, or was this a rhetorical exaggeration to magnify the horror? While the details remain contested, the consistency of the reports across cultures makes one thing clear: impalement was real, and it was used precisely because of the terror it inspired. In remembering impalement, we confront not just one execution method, but an entire philosophy of rule, the belief that power is most secure when it is made visible through fear. The stake was not just wood. It was a message carved into the landscape, a declaration that defiance would end not only in death, but in the most public, degrading death imaginable. It is easy to recoil from these stories, to dismiss them as relics of a barbaric past. Yet they remind us that the line between justice and cruelty has always been thin, and that societies across the world have used punishment not merely to enforce laws but to perform authority. The stake, like the gallows or the guillotine, was as much about controlling the living as it was about punishing the condemned. Impalement's legacy endures in the way we talk about fear, cruelty, and tyranny. It survives in the legends of Vlad the Impaler, in the propaganda of medieval wars, and in the nightmares conjured by historical imagination. Above all, it survives as a warning that when authority seeks to rule through terror, it will always find methods that degrade as much as they destroy. If this dark exploration of impalement and its history has drawn you in, Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into the most chilling aspects of history, and share it with those who are fascinated by the brutal realities behind the past. By studying punishments like these, we not only uncover how fear shaped entire societies, but we also reflect on how echoes of such cruelty still haunt the way power is performed today.